Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, How Do We Utilize Green Space in Cities to Combat Climate Change? It's so great to have everyone here with us this afternoon. This webinar is sponsored by the BU Alumni Association. My name's Corinne. I work on the Alumni Relations team at BU as the Assistant Director of Alumni Networks. So I want to get started with our presentation today. We only have an hour together, but just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. Today's presentation is being recorded, and there's going to be contact information for our speakers. You'll see that on the slide deck for your reference in case you want to contact them directly if you have any questions, and in case your questions don't get answered during today's presentation. In the same vein, our speakers are very eager to answer all questions that you have. If you're new to Zoom at this point, it dictates our lives, right? So if you've joined, or if you've never joined a webinar before, at the bottom of your screen, there's a toolbar and there's a box that says Q&A. That is where you're going to submit questions if you have them throughout the presentation. So with that said, I want to turn it over to our moderator, Catherine Lusk. She's the founding executive director of Boston University's Initiative on Cities. So Catherine, take it away.
Thank you so much, Corinne. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you with us. As Corinne mentioned, my name is Catherine Lusk. I serve as founding executive director and co-director of the BU Initiative on Cities. If you're not familiar with us, we're a university-wide research and learning initiative that really seeks to catalyze new urban scholarship and research across the entire BU community, create meaningful experiential learning opportunities for students, and also foster new connections inside and outside of BU. It is a real pleasure to host you all today. It's also a pleasure to get to moderate this conversation with two incredible women and colleagues who I've had the very wonderful pleasure of working with in a whole variety of ways over the last 6 years. So first, I want to take a moment to introduce them. They're both going to present some brief slides, dig into some of the science. I'll pose some questions, and then I also want to leave ample time for all of you to submit questions as well. So first, we are joined by Lucy Hutyra, an associate professor in the Department of Earth and Environment at Boston University. She uses principles from a number of different scientific fields to understand the terrestrial carbon cycle and the impact of humans on carbon pools and fluxes. She also leads BU's Urban Climate Initiative and the Campus Climate Lab. We're also joined by Pam Templer, a professor in the Department of Biology. Pam serves as the director of both BU's Biogeoscience doctoral program and the BU Urban Doctoral Program in Biogeosciences and Environmental Health, which I know she's going to talk about today. In her own research and her lab's research, she focuses on the effects of environmental change, including climate change, atmospheric deposition, and urbanization and biogeochemical cycling of carbon and nitrogen in urban and rural ecosystems. So with that, it's a mouthful. They are impressive. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Lucy to take us through her slides.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine. You guys saw the punchline. It's not supposed to go that way. So it's a really fun topic that we're going to be able to discuss today. So we're going to talk about green space and the role of green space in combating climate change and pollution. I suspect our conversation will meander a little bit because it's hard to just think about the green stuff in the city and not think about the city as a whole. So this is one of my favorite pictures of Boston. This is looking from the BU area over towards the Boston Common, and in the background you can see the Seaport District, and the city is incredibly heterogeneous. In the Seaport District area, if we zoom in, there's not a lot of trees there, and there's a lot of development, a lot of new development that's taken place there. And you contrast that with the ComAv Mall area, and there's also high density development that's in place there, but it's interspersed with these incredible large stature trees. And when we think about the city, and when we think about green space in the city, we need to look at the places where the green space is and where the green space isn't, and think about how that ends up influencing the environment, our perception of the environment, our mental health, and a whole myriad of other things. So let me start out with a little biology 101 lesson. And most of my career has been spent studying carbon dioxide, CO2. And classically, we think about CO2 as a balance between the carbon cycle is a balance between photosynthesis, where plants take up CO2, break a water bond, release oxygen, the lungs of the earth. In addition, there's respiration. And respiration is the decomposition processes, it's the maintenance of the plants to just be alive. And for a lot of the carbon cycle focuses on these two processes. The yellow arrow is a little bigger than the red arrow because we have globally more photosynthesis than we have respiration.
Lucy, I'm going to pause you for only one moment just because the slides aren't advancing as we can see them, just so you're aware.
So let's try that again. Do you see fossil fuels?
We see Harvard Forest.
Okay. With arrows?
With there.
All right. So, and in this area that's dominated by trees, most of the fluxes, most of the movement of CO2, which is our most important climate gas, is about the biological system, with very little CO2 that's released through combustion of fossil fuels. If you contrast that with this ComAv, the public garden portion of Boston, things look different. Photosynthesis and respiration still happen, but at much smaller scales because there's simply fewer trees. And the fossil fuel signal is much, much larger. And there's a trade-off and a competition for space that's happening in this area as well. If you have trees, you may not be able to have roads or as many buildings. And so when we think about the sustainability, we need to think about where we put things and what those things do. So I want to take a minute to focus on the fossil fuels. Cities are amazing hubs of innovation and education and release of CO2. 80% of our global CO2 emissions happen in cities. They're attributable to cities. And so when we think about the sustainability and the climate of the urban system, we have to think about the gases that we're releasing in cities. We also need to think about that photosynthesis and the respiration. It turns out that trees in cities don't behave like their country cousins. This graph is showing in green, this is the Harvard forest. This is literally our textbook forest. This is in central Massachusetts, far from lots of development, versus Boston. If we look at the same size tree, same species of tree, it grows much, much faster in the city than it does outside the city. So the city is also a hub for productivity in this, in the sense of what the biology is doing. We have many fewer trees, but the trees that we have are doing an incredible service in terms of the growth and how much carbon dioxide they're taking up on a tree by tree basis. So when we think about conservation and where might we want to add trees or maintain trees, we need to think about, well, what are the trees doing and how else might that land be used? So these trees that grow really quickly in cities, the way that they do that is they're taking up carbon dioxide. Well, in the process of taking up carbon dioxide, they release water. So they're taking water from the soil and they're releasing it into the air, which is actually, I think, one of the largest services that trees do for our urban environment, which is they release water into the atmosphere and they cool it. So trees are able to offset the urban heat island. And what's shown in this map, this is from work I'm doing with colleagues in the School of Public Health, is a demand versus supply map for the Boston area, looking at where do we need the most ecosystem services from trees to cool our environment. So some of the highest needs are over here in the bright reds versus where are we getting it? Well, in the darkest greens, you could see where we're getting a huge amount of cooling from the urban vegetation. But in this area, there's very few people and very little demand. So when we think about where to put trees, we should think about where do we need them the most, and those trade-offs in where we put them, what are we offsetting, and how can we optimize this? And when we try to reimagine what the green space in our city can look like to combat climate change and pollution, we're at an amazing crossroads right now. A global pandemic is not a good way to control greenhouse gas emissions or pollutants, but this global pandemic has changed a lot about how we live and how we use our cities. This is data up through last week of what the traffic counts look like in the Boston area. You can see how much they plummeted by about a third in the peak of the pandemic, but they haven't rebounded all the way back. There's a lot of people that have changed how they use the city. The role of that urban green space has also been reimagined as we've changed how we interact with our environment. And some of those parks that we have in the city have become an incredibly valuable oasis. And maybe there's an opportunity to have some shifting from this sort of utilization of the city by the automobile more towards bicycle usage. And there's trade-offs in this of where we have roads versus where we have bikes versus where we have trees. And I'd love to be able to discuss that more. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Pam. Whose slides will advance smoothly.
Can you see my slide? Wonderful. Okay, just gonna get myself organized on my screen. Great. Great. So I'm going to take the baton from Lucy, and I'm going to talk mostly about pollution in our cities and how that interacts with the use of green space that we have in places like Boston and elsewhere. Well, many of you are probably aware of the fact that human activities such as the burning of fossil fuels, the synthesis and use of fertilizers, and the release of waste into our waterways affects the biogeochemical cycling of many elements, including nitrogen and phosphorus, that in turn influence our air and water quality. Over the last several decades, we know that toxic algal blooms have occurred in the Charles River, caused by both warmer temperatures and contaminated runoff that contains phosphorus. Most management practices aimed at decreasing phosphorus inputs to waterways have focused on runoff, like that shown in this diagram, from nearby land surfaces in the forms of fertilizer and waste. Atmospheric inputs of phosphorus, such as that we measure in rain and snow, have long been considered to be negligible and therefore are rarely measured. People just assume it doesn't come from the sky. The original goals of some of the work that Lucy and I have done over the years was to examine atmospheric inputs of different pollutants, such as nitrogen, from the atmosphere. In fact, we found from our studies that while atmospheric inputs of nitrogen have declined throughout much of the United States, they remain quite elevated here in Boston and other coastal cities. When we met with Carl Spector, the Commissioner for the Environment for the City of Boston, to share our nitrogen results, he said, okay, interesting, but what about the phosphorus? He was very interested in how we might be linking some of our measurements of the atmosphere to local water quality of the Charles River and the Boston Harbor. So we went back to the lab at Boston University and we spoke with Steve DeCina, a PhD student who we both co-advised. Steve conducted a study whereby he looked at phosphorus and atmospheric inputs throughout the greater Boston area. Remember, we expected to find negligible amounts of phosphorus in atmospheric deposition, which we measured in rain. Steve placed atmospheric deposition collectors in the open, basically just with no canopy above it, which is represented by the gray bars in this figure, known as bulk deposition. He also placed through-fall collectors beneath the canopy of trees throughout the greater Boston area, as represented by the green bars designated as through-fall. You can see here that rates of phosphorus inputs, as well as nitrogen in the form of nitrate, ammonium, and organic nitrogen, are all greater beneath the canopy than out in the open. We also observed the greatest amounts of atmospheric inputs that fell through tree canopies occurred in the spring. So in this bottom figure, the x-axis represents the months from May through October, and you can see the highest rates of phosphorus coming through the canopy in spring. We think that what's happening is that as tree canopies become filled with birds and insects, as well as flowers and pollen in spring, that there's a large biogenic source of these elements hitting the ground with the potential to move into our nearby waterways. The extra nitrogen and phosphorus that we observe in urban rainfall in spring may also be from local fertilizer inputs. We know that across Boston, approximately 25% of the land is covered by tree canopy, and of this, about 25% is above pavement rather than soils. So this map shows one particular neighborhood where we have canopy in dark green and the areas with canopy above pavement in light green. So typically, if you have a tree canopy above soil and the tree canopy amplifies the amount of nitrogen or phosphorus hitting the ground beneath it, some of it will be recycled in the soil and taken up by trees. So we expect to see very little movement of those pollutants into nearby waterways. However, in places like Boston, where we have significant tree canopy over pavement, it's more likely that phosphorus, nitrogen, and other elements won't be cycled biologically in place by plants and soil microbes, and we then can expect to see larger amounts of fluxes of these pollutants into our nearby waterways, like the Charles River. But does this really amount to much? Is it significant? When we scaled these results up to the entire city of Boston, we found that the amount of phosphorus coming in through atmospheric deposition, so through rain throughout an entire growing season, amounts to about 23% of the amount of inorganic P in sewage effluent, showing that even though in the past we've assumed that phosphorus inputs from the atmosphere are negligible, that we're seeing measurable amounts in Boston that could actually be influencing our water quality. So what this work shows is that if we want to use green space to improve our air and water quality in cities, we can't ignore what is falling from the sky in the form of atmospheric deposition, and we need to be mindful of where we plant trees and whether we place pavement or soil beneath them. And that's true for all pollutants, whether you're looking at nitrogen, phosphorus, or other processes like green space uptake of ozone and particulates. And so what I'm going to do now for just the last couple minutes of my presentation is pivot a bit to share with you how all of us on this call are training the future workforce to use scientific tools and to work with partners to solve urban environmental challenges such as air and water pollution. So I'm going to share with you a program we have at Boston University that we began in 2017. We received an NSF, or National Science Foundation Research Traineeship, or NRT program grant. This program launched in 2014 at NSF with 5-year, $3 million grants for interdisciplinary graduate programs. We just admitted our third cohort this fall. And so why would we create this program that we call Urban, or the Boston University Graduate Program in Urban Biogeoscience and Environmental Health? We know that cities are facing numerous environmental challenges related to climate, water, air, land use change, and other environmental challenges in an increasingly urban world. And we know that to tackle these problems, we need to bring multiple disciplines together. There's also the importance of engagement with cities, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector to ensure that the work we're doing is utilized and is taken up. We also know that at the same time, graduate students want solution-oriented training. And so in this program, we're using cities as a living laboratory for their training. Our program is at the intersection of the field of biogeoscience, or just looking at how the earth functions, and environmental health, which is how we look at, in turn, changes in the environment affect human health. We're looking at environmental changes that affect our air, water, climate, and other attributes of the environment. And in our program, our students are gaining valuable skills through Catherine Lusk and others at the Initiative on Cities, the Institute of Sustainable Energy. We partner with WBUR and others at BU to provide science communication workshop, as well as BU's Best to provide professional development. All of the graduate students in our program partner with either the private sector, city governments, or non-governmental organizations so that they can formulate research questions using a collaborative process from the beginning. So they're not doing science and then just sharing their results. The idea is they're formulating projects that they know from the start are actually useful to the partners who they're working with. This is just an example of many of the organizations our students have already been working with, again, across government, non-government, and the private sector on an array of exciting projects, all at this interface of biogeoscience, environmental health, tackling urban environmental challenges. And I'm excited to report that it's a very fun program. We bring our students together, pre-COVID in person, and now we've pivoted and now we're online and still having a wonderful time with many interactive program events where students can learn from each other as well as their partners. And so what can you do to engage with us? Well, all of you on this call are invited to interact with us. You're welcome to collaborate with us to recruit students from underrepresented groups. You're welcome to participate in our events and workshops, and certainly reach out and connect to us. You can email us at urban@bu.edu, follow us on Instagram and Twitter, certainly join our listserv if you want to hear about all sorts of program events, and visit our website to see what we're up to. So thank you very much, and I'm excited to have a discussion with all of you.
Great, thank you both. So I wanted to start by asking a question to Lucy. Lucy, you've been to my neighborhood. I live in Boston. I live in the neighborhood of Roslindale. And you know, maybe you recall from having been here before, that there's a lot, I live in a sort of, there's a wealth of green space around me, but there's different kinds of green space. And I have street trees in front of my home. I have an urban wetland actually right down the street. I have a manicured park that's largely a baseball field and a dog run across the street. And I actually live in really close proximity to the Harvard Arboretum. And in addition, there's also sort of urban wilds, what the city classifies as urban wilds, which are really unmanicured natural green spaces with a significant amount of tree canopy. So you talked a little bit about supply and benefit, and I'm wondering if you can explain to all of us some of the differential benefits that those different types of green space provide to all of us in cities.
Maybe to start out with an easy question, Catherine. We need lots of things from our ecosystems. There isn't one demand. What I described was focused on carbon dioxide, and that's one service that trees provide. But those wetlands, those provide a buffering to storms and water inundation. Those manicured green lawn areas also serve a purpose. You see children playing ball there. You see the dogs. There's a lot of different services. And so one of our challenges, and maybe this is why I'm a scientist and not a planner, is how do we optimize for all of these? And our city we need street trees, we need parks, we need wetlands, we need wilds, but we also need spaces for children to play organized sports. And when we think about developing and redeveloping and maintaining our city, we need to think about the suite of constituents and the ecosystem services that we're trying to support. It's not one thing that will work for all of the things that we're trying to attain from our environment. And it's easy to overlook some of the areas that you described, like the wetland areas that maybe have less traffic than that playground. But they both perform really important services to our community and to our environment.
So you use the word optimize. So I want to ask you to go, I know you're not a policymaker, but go a little further and say, what are some of the ways that you've seen policymakers and community activists and others effectively optimize to manage or create the types of green spaces and the diversity of green spaces that we need across cities and across neighborhoods?
So it's a hard problem, because you want to put trees, you want to put green space, you want to put a green space that people will use, but you also want to put those spaces where people want them. And we've actually had some really interesting, surprising exchanges over the years. We did work probably a decade ago on the Million Trees New York project, where we were looking at the soil chemistry and the soil pits where they were planting some of those trees for the Million Tree effort in New York. And as we were on the streets of New York, people were like, oh no, don't put a tree. Some people were saying that because there was a disservice associated in their mind with putting that tree there, because it was going to attract animals that were potentially going to defecate on their sidewalk. It was going to create a mess, and there might not be anybody to clean up the mess. Or there's some really fascinating studies that have come out of Detroit where people said that they didn't want trees, where environmental groups were going in and saying, let us green your neighborhood. We will plant these trees in your neighborhood for free. And not all the community members wanted it, because they may plant the tree, but those community groups may not be there later to maintain the tree. So when we think about optimizing, we need to think about who's in the community, how is the space likely to be used, and how will it be taken care of in the longer term? Because it's very attractive and easy to have a ribbon cutting ceremony for planting 1 million trees and then not have funds in place to maintain those 1 million trees. And I don't think that there's a single optimization. I think we need to look at where are we planting it and what services are we really trying to attain for that neighborhood. So I've punted and not answered what the optimal distribution is, but I don't think there actually is one. I think it really depends on the place that you're looking at.
Well, it sounds like it's a combination of need and desire, right? So where is there an actual need for the benefits of green space that they afford, including via things like mitigating urban heat island risks, and also where is there a desire for additional green space, which is much more of a community-driven conversation.
And the capacity to maintain it, and the funds to maintain it.
And the funds and will to maintain it. So Pam, I want to turn it over to you. We've been talking about Boston, and you both gave us some examples from Boston. I wonder if you can sort of take us up to a different view and give us a perspective that's beyond Boston, and thinking about, Lucy even mentioned sort of these 1 million tree campaigns. I know there's a 1 billion tree campaign trying to get lots of cities and lots of partners around the world planting trees. What are some of the effective policies that you've seen working, not just here locally, but on a broader scale?
Yeah, well, Lucy did a great job setting me up for this. So we have the 1 billion tree project, right? And now there's the 1 trillion tree project. So people around the globe, there's this increasing recognition that green space has a lot of ecosystem services that it can bear, right? So as Lucy mentioned, they can cool local temperatures, they can reduce pollution, they can take up CO2 directly and mitigate some of human-made fossil, greenhouse gases, and that's all wonderful. And it seems like in the last few years, those efforts have exploded in publicity, that people are trying to plant, now 1 trillion trees across our planet. And that's wonderful that there's this recognition that we can take advantage of our natural ecosystems or plant new trees to basically clean up some of the mess humans have created by loading so many greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. However, one needs to be careful, because as Lucy alluded to, you could plant 1 trillion trees and they might not actually survive. But there's also been a lot of pushback because some people are suggesting we put trees in places where they aren't right now. And so just that single-minded idea of just plant trees for the, planting trees to scrub CO2 and other pollutants out of our atmosphere, we really can't lose sight of things like indigenous people who live on landscapes where, are you going to put a plantation in of single species and not allow those indigenous people to live there anymore? What about creating programs that benefit both people, the landscape, our atmosphere, and the climate? So taking a more holistic view than simply saying plant trees. And so I was at the United Nations climate meeting last December, the Conference of the Parties. And this is a funny story. I didn't know before I went that they give out a lot of free food. And so you're always on the lookout for wine or chocolate or apples. And it's kind of a fun side thing that kind of lessens the seriousness of the meeting. And at last December's meeting, they gave out chocolate bars that when you unwrap the bars, it was all about planting trees. And again, on one side, that's wonderful. We want more green space across our entire planet. But one issue is, does that lessen the responsibility to do the flip side, which is to lessen our loading of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere? So I think, obviously we want, I'm not a policymaker either. We want policymakers to understand the importance of green space, and we don't want them to ignore it. But we also don't want it to be simplified so much at the expense of people, or even the ability of ecosystems to support trees, and to think about how we're managing those trees.
So I want to get to a few questions that I'm seeing come in from folks, and then I'll come back to some of mine. One question, I know the three of us have been talking about this a lot recently. John N. asks, are there percentages for the different types of green space that I mentioned for rural versus suburban versus urban communities? So if you want to address that directly, or sort of talk generally about the different types of green spaces, sort of manicured green spaces, open green spaces versus wilds, and the benefits that we get, and the different types of spaces that we see across those rural, suburban, urban gradients.
I don't have a number I don't have a number off the tip of my tongue for that, but I can offer a few statistics that partially answer that question. So in the city of Boston, I think our numbers are about 26% canopy cover currently. And that means that we have trees that are overlaying that. If you look from the air, if you look down at the city, you would have 26% of the area covered in trees. That doesn't mean we have 26% parks or exposed soils like Pam was describing, because a lot of those trees are above pavement. And that number, the percent canopy that you might have, would increase as the area becomes less dense. I don't have a number off the top of my head for suburban or rural, but in the Harvard forest, our textbook rural classic forest, there's almost no development that's present there. So that kind of brackets it. And you have ecosystems and services that can be provided by the environment in areas that have no canopy, right? Whether those are grasslands or wetlands, they don't necessarily have to have trees present to have really, really valuable ecosystem services. And in agricultural areas, you also don't have trees, but there's other important services that are happening there, and you have green, it's green. Then we get into a lot of questions about how is it managed, but that may be a different conversation. Pam, you might have a better answer off the top of your head than I just gave.
Yeah, I don't know numbers other than what you said. Like in a rural part of New England, you can get I wouldn't say 100% forest cover, but you certainly can. And then Boston, which is a relatively green city, that 26% number is pretty high, and then everything in between. So I don't have a lot to add.
One of the things we need to think about is this is a dynamic number. Trees are always growing, which is good, but they're dying. And in a city, you don't have a lot of natural regeneration of trees. So I know the city of Boston right now is about to undertake a master forestry plan and trying to think about a longer term management plan for how they're going to approach their green and canopy spaces. And we need to keep in mind that to maintain the canopy we have means we have to be planting trees without even trying to expand the canopy, because trees naturally die. There's a finite lifespan for it. And in the city, it's actually accelerated at the two ends of the lifespan. If you're a new tree that's just been planted, it's a hard place to get established. And you're more likely to die than your country cousin when you're planted in the city. And if you get too big, there's a risk and a liability associated with really large trees in the city too, where limb damage to buildings or to property can become very substantial. And there's a lot of either removals or pretty crazy pruning activities that take place to minimize some of those risks. So when we think about trying to just maintain what we have to have that in mind as well. And what we plant matters also, not just how much we have, but what types of species we have.
Here's a question from Harmeet. Is there more of a benefit to have many tree-lined streets versus single larger open park when you were talking about the phosphates being washed into the waterways and being able to cram in lots of trees? So yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that's a great question we don't necessarily know the answer for. So we know that any vegetation, whether it's a tree, a shrub, a wetland plant, a grass, that's planted along what we call the riparian zone. So the riparian zone is just the strip of land directly adjacent to a waterway like the Charles River or a marsh. Any vegetation that's there is going to take up some of the pollutants, whether it's phosphorus, nitrogen, mercury, sulfur, anything. And so off the cuff, I would say having some vegetation along waterways is better than having a park, making this up, but 10 miles away. So I think it depends on what you're looking for. So if you're looking to filter your water, I'd say make sure you have a buffer strip of vegetation and soils that have active microbes right by that waterway. If you're looking for carbon sequestration, maybe, and again, this is off the cuff, you want a big patch of trees that are healthy, actively growing, taking up carbon. With more trees, you have more erosion control, more soil retention of different things. So I think it really depends on your question and what you're trying to look at.
ask, this is a question for me. I want to ask, can you hear me? Did it unmute? Yeah. Back when we were all traveling, I went to a conference in Boulder and was impressed walking around neighborhoods in Boulder, both that I saw many, many signs for pollinator gardens that had been supported by the municipality, and they were trying to get more people to plant pollinator gardens both on private property and in public space. One of the other things that was common in Boulder was actually taking the street grid and actually closing off streets and planting trees, where instead of a long roadway that would have basically induced people to speed and to cut through residential neighborhoods, they actually were closing off the ends of the grids, and then they were reclaiming what had been asphalt, presumably, and planting trees and planting pollinator gardens. I'm wondering, there's a couple of questions in there, one of which is, this gets back in part to the, some of the effective things that policymakers can do on the local level, but also some of the ways that we could be both investing in sort of conscientious decision-making on private property that individuals own and businesses own, and then also potentially reclaiming some of these sort of asphalt heat-inducing spaces and reclaiming them for green space. I'm curious what your perspectives are on both of those. And I'll let Lucy, do you want to go first?
Sure. There was a lot.
There was a lot in there.
There was a lot in there. Responding to closing off streets, I think that can be a great idea as a way of increasing green space, increasing access and connection of people to their green space. But it has to be done really carefully, because there could be some really unintended consequences of that in terms of what does it do to traffic congestion, and which streets are you closing off, and are there alternatives? Well, it's very easy and tempting to say, well, we should all just get out of our cars and bicycle everywhere, or we should take public transit everywhere. But there has to be public transit to take, and there has to be an affordability that people can actually live close enough to where they're trying to commute to their job if they have to commute to their job. Like I'm in my office today. I'm not working from home today because I taught a class. And we have to have an entire system that's coordinated around this. We can't just take an approach of let's close off the street because we want trees and green space, which that can achieve a lot of wonderful goals, but for it to really work towards a broader agenda, we need to think about the whole system. I think they call it a complete streets sort of approach to thinking about how are people moving, walking, how are they interacting with that green space. Street trees are incredibly important in higher density residential areas to mitigate some of the heat island effects, especially in areas that have hot summers like we have here. Those trees end up shading, and so they'll reduce what the incident radiation and heating looks like. And like I was mentioning, they're also going to cool by evaporating water. But we really have to think hard about where we put those trees. As a homeowner with a lovely tree in my front yard, I just had to pay a plumber a large amount of money so that my toilets would work again, because the tree had grown into all the pipes. And so it goes back to that right tree, right place, where we need to have trees that are of the right size and of the right species that are located in a place where they're really going to be viable. And your other comment about pollinators, I completely agree. And, when I'm not working, one of my favorite things to do is garden. And my garden is a mess, but it's also an incredibly rewarding mess for me personally, but also for the array of species that use it. So I think improved education around what we can plant beyond just tomato plants, to have different kinds of backyard services that are provided.
Do you want me to add to that, Catherine?
Yeah, I was going to ask, and in particular, either the pollinator gardens, but also this question around sort of the public versus private.
Sure. So I'll just mention with the pollinators, that's a wonderful example of co-benefits. that people can plant beautiful flowers in their garden and also benefit our environment by increasing the abundance and health of our pollinators. So that, I think, has a lot to do with education, that letting the public know that the decisions you make on your private land can make a big difference for the community at large. And I didn't even know Boulder had that program, incentivizing that. So making it not only known that it makes an impact, but also incentivizing it is so important. I was just going to mention that private-public partnerships is so important. I think about the northeastern US versus the western US. So in the Northeast, a lot of our tree canopy, most of it is on private land. And so if we want to preserve it, we can't ignore the people who live on that land, because it's individual families making decisions about whether to cut those 20 trees in the backyard this year to afford retirement versus not, is what's dictating whether we have forest cover in many places. And so whereas out west, a lot of our big forest cover is on public federal land, which raises different questions about how to manage it. So when we think about the city of Boston and how much tree cover we have here, I think we need to have even greater education about what people can do on their own land to either plant trees, plant native tree species, think about the longevity of those species, the maintenance of those species, who's responsible for those species. So many people don't realize that the city doesn't come around and water the street trees. So if they plant a new tree, you need to come in many places and maintain it. So don't forget to water it unless you want it to perhaps die. And then there's the issue of gas leaks that are killing a lot of our trees around Boston. And so I think it's thinking about the whole picture, from what are we planting, how are we maintaining them, and what are the decisions on both private and public land as to whether to maintain those trees or not is really important.
So we have a question. We talked a lot about street trees and parks and gardens, and we have a question from Lark. Any thoughts on environmental impact of pervious pavement or green walls or roofs? I'll let you decide whether one or both of you want to respond to that.
So each of those kind of green infrastructure tools, if you will, is trying to serve a different purpose. In the case of green roofs, the green roofs they can do a tremendous amount to filter, to change the flashiness of incoming rainwater, so they can buffer against large rain events, not to overwhelm sewer systems, and just kind of slow everything down so that there's a chance for the natural and the built system to be able to respond to that. But just like the street trees, they have to be maintained. And there are some studies that are suggesting that green roofs, when they're not properly maintained, may not actually help very much, at least from a biogeochemical perspective. But green roofs can also do a tremendous amount for kind of your mental health, of being able to look out and use a space that wasn't previously usable for a different purpose. Green roofs are not a panacea solution to sequestering carbon. There's not enough space for the carbon to go, but they can do a lot in terms of water, in changing the water that's going into our sewers and our wastewater. And they can also cool the city if they're maintained to be constantly evaporating water and cooling that local environment. Green walls have some of those same benefits, but it depends on what the wall is made of. Ivy can do a lot of building damage, but other things don't. And there was a third one, permeable pavement. The permeable pavement, I may punt on this to Pam to offer some more thoughts. I think the permeable pavement can do a lot for water, but we need to think about not just water, but the soil and the nutrients. Because if you have if you have a tree that's growing in a tree pit that has permeable pavement that's covering it, that permeable pavement means that the water will be able to seep through and potentially support that tree to survive. But the leaves and the nutrients that would naturally be cycled there may not be there anymore, because they're just going to be cleaned up and taken away. And so you could change what the nutrient status and the balance of that location is pretty dramatically. In other places, and there's some parts in Boston and anywhere, you could have little tiny tree pits, you could have strips, or you could have open park stretches. And you can't necessarily change what capacity you have in a built city to be able to all of a sudden create these giant strips. But if you're redeveloping places, there might be more benefits in some of these places to put strips where the soil is really connected to the atmosphere and the ecosystem around it. That might be more beneficial, but that's also not possible everywhere. Pam, I welcome you to add to that.
Yeah, I was just going to add a couple of quick points because you said that well, is that green roofs also have the benefit where you have gardens, right? So that's another co-benefit for local communities that have the resources to grow food that can then be utilized by local communities is a wonderful benefit. I was also just going to mention local management decisions. Lucy brought up the great point that in nature, our trees recycle their own nutrients. It's pretty amazing, right? They fix carbon out of the atmosphere for photosynthesis, but then every year they regenerate a lot of their own nutrition by dropping their leaves. Those leaves decompose and they get inorganic nutrients that then they take up in the following growing season. And in cities, we really like to disrupt that, right? We don't like the messiness of leaves on the ground. So what do? We clean them up, we ship them off. And a lot of places like Boston, they're composted and used for urban gardens. So I'm not saying in itself that's a bad thing, but just something to think about for all of our local plants, whether, you're thinking about a rooftop garden that's now separate from any sort of, natural recycling, or street tree where you have impervious surface area and you're brushing off the leaves. Where are the extra nutrients coming from? Do we have to fertilize? Lucy and I did a study that we're about to publish with some students from BU, where we looked at land cover across the BU campus and found that in areas where BU is mulching, we see really high rates of CO2 losses out of the soils just due to plant and microbial respiration. And so pervious by itself isn't always good, right? You're growing plants and that's wonderful, but you have to think about how you're managing that landscape as well, because you might be altering both the ability to retain nutrients and pollutants so they don't get in our waterways, but also affecting how much CO2 ultimately you're releasing back to the atmosphere.
And some of the maintenance costs of that can also be through the roof from a greenhouse gas perspective. If you have to drive a truck and you have leaf blowers or vacuums or something like that that's collecting, relocating all of this, you put it in a truck, you take it to some sort of compost facility, and then it goes in another truck and it gets reapplied. That full cost accounting can paint a pretty complicated picture of how much carbon benefit you might actually be getting from some of that, which goes back to if you can plant in a strip where maybe the leaves just stay there because they're not bothering anybody, they're not creating a safety hazard, the sidewalks are still safe to walk on because the strip might be adjacent to the sidewalk. That might be a lower input system that is more efficient from an ecological perspective, but it depends on the location.
I'm gonna come back. There is a question about BU Urban. So I want to start with a question for me about BU Urban and then pose this question as well. So my question, Pam, was I'm wondering if you could share with the group a little bit some of the examples, and I have one in mind in particular, but some of the examples of the types of projects students have been engaged in. The one that comes to mind for me, of course, relates to your comment about sort of putting the right tree in the right place. And that is sort of particularly, timely if you want to share that story or others that you think are relevant. And then there was also a question from an attendee who said, are there ways to get involved in urban for alumni who don't have a science background? So if you could just take both of those.
Sure. Yeah, I'll quickly take the second one because I'm really excited about that. Reach out to us. We'd love your involvement. This is a very outward looking program. We're certainly trying to train our students in what we call a T-based approach. We didn't come up with that. I think it's a wonderful name for approach where we're trying to train our students in deep disciplinary knowledge, but we're also trying to train them to work collaboratively across disciplines. So this includes traditional scientific disciplines as well as non-scientific disciplines. They're learning about urban governance through Catherine and others. They're learning about science policy communication. So please don't be shy about reaching out. If you don't have a science background, we want to hear from you. So reach out to me at P. Templer or reach out to our program urban@bu.edu. We want to hear from you. Some sample projects, I'll just give you a few quickly. So let's see, David Reynolds from Statistics has been working with BioBot. He originally partnered with them to help bring a new statistical approach to their work where they look at sewer water and they were trying to detect areas of high use of opioids. And then they quickly pivoted. It was pretty amazing this spring to trying to detect COVID in sewer water. So he's brought a really nice, robust approach to them that they hadn't been using before to try to constrain their estimates of uncertainty and variance, and really worked with them well to, again, serve the public and trying to figure out where we're having COVID hotspots. Catherine, I think are you thinking of Arlington, that project? Yeah. So one of Lucy's students, actually, Luca Morelli, did a project in Arlington where he worked with their tree warden. And the whole goal of that project was to help them understand where the needs were in Arlington for where we need more cooling, where there are potential locations to plant new trees. And he created what he calls a shovel-ready project during his internship with Arlington to help them prioritize areas to plant new trees. So I thought that was really cool. One other project I'll just mention, Kate Connolly is working with Andover, where during summer, she helped them model CO2 concentrations in classrooms in their public schools, and to use that as a direct proxy for ventilation in the classrooms to help them plan ahead for this school year in terms of what rooms were safe to place kids in, to make sure that the air was ventilating enough that they weren't going to be as exposed to COVID. So we run the whole gamut from tree planting, soils, opioid, COVID, public health issues. Basically, if there's a partner out there looking to solve a challenge and our students have the skills, we try to match them up so that the students learn how to apply their skills, but the partner is gaining somebody who wants to work with them to help solve a problem that's real world.
Great. I want to give a note to Gabriella. I saw you put your hand up. I don't know if that was by accident or intentional. If you have a question, though, if you could put it in the Q&A. Another question that we got from someone who registered for today's discussion: how can citizens do their part to fully utilize green spaces and raise awareness about them to other people?
They can engage. And I think there's like a million ways that they could engage. You know, there's adopt a tree efforts. There's, if trees are planted, actually support it by filling up the gator bag to help keep that tree alive and get its root system established. They could engage in the 311 system if there's a problem, if there's a need for maintenance somewhere, they can let the city know. The city may not know exactly what's happening on your street as well as you know what's happening on your street. They could engage in public meetings and community events and cleanup events. They can advocate in like a million different ways.
Pam, any other thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think engagement is number one, and educating yourself. So if you're unsure where to even look, reach out to us. Look in your local town's government. They often will have either an urban forestry plan, a tree warden. They call it many different things across different towns and cities, but your town or city likely has something. And so the first place I would recommend is just go to your government website and look at what people are doing, look at associated nonprofits who are working to advocate for green space, and then get involved. Volunteer if you have that luxury of time to work with these different groups, or at least write them letters or reach out to them. Just to talk about the benefits of green space, because not everyone knows about it. You know, just like any issue, we shouldn't assume that this is front and center for policymakers. Obviously, we're in the middle of a pandemic, but every decision policymakers make can feed back to whether we have green space, human health, reaching human health and equity and things like that. So just reaching out to your policymakers and saying, hey, are you aware of this? Anything I could do to help, I think is important.
Pandemics also created incredible opportunities where things that we just did not imagine as being possible are happening. To have such a pivot of how people end up working, how they're being transported, how many people are in our parks now, how many more people are in our parks, how many people are just walking around and getting to know their community and their environment. That is, again, a pandemic is a poor strategy to achieve these things, but there have been some good things that have come out of this.
Yeah, Lucy, I think about a year ago, would anybody have predicted that parking spaces would be replaced with restaurant seating? I think that's just an interesting, we can get creative, even if it's not a pandemic, about how we want to utilize our space.
I'm okay. Last call to the audience members for if you have any final questions, please submit them. I want to just say on this point for one more minute about the pandemic. So Harmeet had also submitted a question saying, does the panel think there will be a knock-on effect with COVID-19 and stories of people fleeing cities? and the necessity of green spaces as much as we all want it, with the possibility of falling urban populations. But it sounds like what you're saying is what we've seen in our research with mayors. One of the things we do is lead a survey of mayors across the country. And in surveying mayors this past summer, the pandemic is, in fact, it's not, there is fear about people leaving cities. But in context of green space, there is renewed energy. There is a desire to make more investment in green space because more people seem to be aware of it. They're seeking it out. They're spending time in it. Can you spend another minute just talking about what the implications, the long-term implications might be of the pandemic on green space in cities, if any?
Do you want to start?
Go ahead, Lucy. If you have
Well, I don't know, but I think it's turned on its head some of our notions of what the future was going to look like, or what we wanted the future to look like. The transit-oriented, high-density development adjacent to train lines is very much and electrification of everything, and a really strong concentration is where the discussion and conversation had been. And I don't know if that's where it's going to necessarily stay. We also have some incredible challenges that we're not talking about yet around the financial viability of some of our transit systems as ridership has plummeted. I don't know, but we certainly see a lot of interesting kind of teasers of how people are moving. And maybe it's I personally know a number of people who have left New York and Boston and are just working remote in rural locations. That can put a lot of pressure on that rural location that they've suddenly moved into. But will they stay there? I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just add to that to say probably many people have heard this new term, Zoom towns, right? Where people are moving from cities into rural areas, working from home. And that's placing, a surprise. Who knows, like you said, whether this will last, but, suddenly there's higher enrollments in local schools. There's people buying up property, raising prices. Will this last? If people are buying homes, I imagine that's going to have a lasting effect. They're going to stay, at least in some capacity. But how this is going to affect local economies in the long term and the population base and tax base of cities, I think this is going to be fascinating to look at over the long term.
There's a lot of equity challenges in this as well, in terms of not everyone can afford to go suddenly move into a country house in Vermont because their job may not be one that can be performed remotely from these Zoom towns. So there's a huge equity dimension. There's a broadband dimension. Some of these rural towns that they're moving to don't have the internet to even support this. So it may push that and create the internet and the access and the communication. It may end up solving some of those problems faster than they might have happened otherwise. The next year is definitely going to be interesting.
I think I'll close by saying one of the comments we've heard from mayors this summer is that the pandemic has also, it's not only laid bare inequities related to COVID and the inequitable impact it's having on different neighborhoods, particularly communities of color and lower income neighborhoods, but it's also prompting some, not enough, but some cities to revisit where there are parks and green space and whether communities of color and lower income neighborhoods actually have access to green space, access to places to recreate, certainly access to broadband, even at places, access to using broadband outside, right? Where is there free public Wi-Fi and a park bench or a picnic table where people can use it? But more importantly, where are those places that people can go to recreate, to be outside, to safely spend time with friends and family outdoors? And so that's potentially one positive benefit is this, we hope, shift toward equitable master planning for parks and green space, where it's not just about street trees, which are critically important, but it's also about these open recreation spaces and whether everyone in every neighborhood in every city actually has comparable access to high quality parks. We are at time. I just want to say thank you so much to Lucy Hutyra. Thank you so much to Pamela Templer. Thank you to all of you who stayed with us and tuned in, and to VU Alumni Relations for putting the conversation together.
Absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Lucy and Pam, for such a great informative conversation. Thank you to all the alumni and donors in the audience for spending your Monday afternoon with us. We have so many different events happening every day. You can check out our website. It's bu.edu/alumni/events. So take a look at the calendar, see if there's any other events that interest you. And until next time, stay well, and we'll see you later. Thanks, ladies.
Bye. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Corinne.
Bye.